Have you ever stopped and asked yourself, what does personal freedom really mean in this modern world? We often talk about it, fight for it, but do we really understand the origin and rapid transformation of this value over the ages? From primitive hunter-gatherer tribes to smart cities with bright lights, how is the definition of freedom changed? And why, in an increasingly connected world, has the value of personal freedom become more essential and complex than ever? Let's explore this magical journey together to understand why personal freedom is the new value shaping the nature of modern humans. Tens of thousands of years ago, when humans were nomadic hunter-gatherer tribes, the concept of individual freedom almost did not exist in the way we understand it today. Survival was the top priority. Every decision and action served the common good of the tribe, ensuring survival in the harsh natural environment. An individual's freedom, if any, was only within the limits of strict community rules formed through thousands of generations of survival experience. A hunter could not arbitrarily leave the group. A gatherer could not refuse communal work. Everyone was an inseparable part of a whole, and voluntarily separating from the community often meant death. The individual I was completely immersed in the we of the community, where identity was shaped by role and position in the group. Choice of mate, food, or shelter was often governed by tribal rules, beliefs, and basic survival needs. The purpose of life is not self-actualization, but rather the preservation, protection, and development of the tribe. Individual desires, if any, must be reconciled with the collective good. Punishments for violating community norms were often severe, ranging from ostracism to expulsion, demonstrating the absolute priority of the group. The agricultural revolution brought stability, the ability to accumulate food, and allowed populations to soar. However, it also sowed the seeds for new, more complex forms of restrictions on freedom. As people abandoned their nomadic ways for settled, land-based lifestyles, they became farmers, and land became a valuable asset. The emergence of private property, complex social systems with clear stratification, and centralized power structures such as kingdoms and empires radically reshaped life. Individual freedom was constrained by heavy labor obligations, high taxes, and obedience to the aristocracy, clergy, or kings who controlled the land. A farmer had no freedom to move from the land he worked, no right to choose another occupation, and no right to own his own labor. They were tied to the land, to their social position, with a life course virtually predetermined from birth and little opportunity for change. The early legal systems often served to maintain social order and protect the interests of the ruling elite, rather than to protect individual rights. Slavery and serfdom became an integral part of the economies, the clearest evidence of the lack of basic freedom. In ancient civilizations, the first notions of individual liberty began to emerge, albeit in a limited, selective manner, often only for a privileged few. In ancient Greece, and especially Athens, male citizens who owned land and had a certain social status enjoyed political freedom, participated in city decisions through democratic assemblies, and had the right to speak publicly and vote. This was a major advance over the authoritarian agricultural societies. However, the definition of citizen at that time was limited, excluding women, slaves, and foreigners, who made up the majority of the population and still lived in conditions of deprivation of basic rights. Much of their lives were still determined by their gender, birth, or legal status. In Rome, the concept of Roman citizenship also brought certain rights and privileges, such as the right to a fair trial, but it also maintained widespread slavery and a clear system of social stratification. Philosophers such as Plato and Aristotle pondered the good life, but these thoughts were often linked to civic virtue, the role of the individual in an ideal state, and rarely placed great value on absolute freedom or the ability of each independent individual to determine his own fate. The European Middle Ages, which lasted for nearly a millennium, saw the dominance of feudalism and the absolute power of the Catholic Church, which severely restricted individual freedom and redefined it within a rigid framework. People were born into a specific caste, from kings, nobles, clergy to serfs, and had little ability to change their fate. Serfs were tied to the lord's land, had no freedom to move or marry without permission, and were required to perform heavy labor obligations. Their lives were tightly controlled by feudal and canonical rules, with every aspect of their diet, lifestyle, and thinking strictly adhered to. The Catholic Church shaped the entire worldview, moral system, and even human thinking. Any difference in belief or ideology could be considered heresy and faced harsh punishments, from social isolation to being burned at the stake. Freedom of speech and freedom of religion were alien concepts. Individual worth was measured by obedience to God, loyalty to kingship, and assigned social position, not by the ability to self-determine, self-express, or pursue one's own desires. The first seeds of individual freedom began to germinate more strongly, challenging traditional structures during the Renaissance, 14th to 17th centuries, and the Reformation, 16th century. The Renaissance movement in Europe celebrated humanism, placing man at the center instead of seeing him as a passive instrument of God or a cog in the social machine. Great artists such as Leonardo da Vinci, Michelangelo, scientists such as Copernicus and Galileo, and thinkers began to explore the limitless potential of human beings, encouraging creativity and independent thinking. The value of the individual, the ability to think and contribute uniquely, was promoted. Martin Luther's Reformation further promoted the idea of a direct personal relationship with God through faith, reducing the mediating role and absolute power of the Church. This encouraged individuals to read and reflect on the Bible for themselves, thereby strengthening freedom of conscience and freedom of religion, laying the foundation for the later separation of church and state. Although there was still much conflict and repression, these movements paved the way for the breakdown of old power structures, encouraged spiritual autonomy, and laid the foundation for the rise of the individual I, an essential element of the modern concept of personal freedom. The 17th and 18th centuries, with the Age of Enlightenment, were a golden age that shaped the modern concept of individual liberty, bringing it from a vague notion to a clear ideological and political foundation. Great philosophers such as John Locke, Jean-Jacques Rousseau, Montesquieu, and Voltaire vigorously defended the idea of natural rights, the rights to life, liberty, and property, rights that they believed could not be taken away by any government. Locke argued that humans were born with fundamental rights and that governments, established by the consent of the people through a social contract, were responsible for protecting these rights. Rousseau promoted the general will of the people and autonomy of individuals in a democratic society. Freedom of speech, freedom of the press, freedom of religion, and the right to be protected by law became core values, indispensable for a civilized society. Major revolutions such as the American Revolution in 1776 and the French Revolution in 1789 made these ideas a reality, declaring equality and freedom for all citizens. This was the first time in history that individual freedom was placed at the center of a political and social system, no longer a privilege of a minority, but a basic right of every human being. However, the implementation of this ideal still had many limitations and profound contradictions, with women, people of color, and slaves. The Industrial Revolution, which exploded in the 19th century, brought tremendous economic growth and rapid urbanization, but also created new challenges to individual freedom. Millions of people left the countryside to work in factories and mines, gaining geographical freedom, but facing extremely harsh working conditions, long hours of work, toxic and unsafe environments, and exploitative wages that were not enough to live on. The freedom to enter into a labor contract turned out to be a forced freedom in difficult economic circumstances, with no choice but to sell one's labor. The capitalist economy developed strongly, creating enormous wealth, but accompanied by a deep polarization of rich and poor,
where economic freedom for some meant deprivation, dependence, and oppression for many. Social movements and trade unions began to rise, vigorously fighting for workers' rights, demanding more equality, reduced working hours, improved working conditions, and protection from freedom from exploitation. This was a period when the concept of individual freedom was not limited to political rights, but extended to economic and social rights, raising profound questions about the boundary between individual freedom and social responsibility, between individual freedom and the need for state intervention to ensure justice. The 20th century saw a significant expansion in the scope and depth of individual freedom beyond traditional political and economic frameworks. Movements for civil rights, such as Martin Luther King, women's suffrage, and African American rights.
The 20th century saw a significant expansion in the scope and depth of individual freedom, beyond traditional political and economic frameworks. Movements for civil rights, such as Martin Luther King Jr., women's suffrage, and African American rights, profoundly changed the social fabric, forcing nations to rethink their definitions of citizenship and human rights. Individual freedom was no longer just the right to participate in politics or own property, but also the right to be oneself, to choose one's lifestyle, gender identity, and cultural identity without discrimination. The struggle against dictatorships and colonialism solidified national and individual freedom as universal ideals, widely recognized by the world. International organizations such as the United Nations were established, promulgating the Universal Declaration of Human Rights in 1948, affirming the inalienable rights of every human being, regardless of race, sex, religion, or nationality. This was the period when individual freedom truly became a universal value, widely recognized globally, although its implementation remains a great challenge and requires constant struggle in many parts of the world, showing the complexity and multifacetedness of this concept. Entering the 21st century and the digital age, with the explosion of the internet and information technology, personal freedom has taken on a new, complex and contradictory meaning, opening up both unprecedented opportunities and challenges. The internet and social networks have given each person the ability to connect unlimitedly with the world, freedom of speech on a large global forum, and access to huge information with just one click. We can learn by ourselves, do business online, build our own communities, and express ourselves in diverse and creative ways never before seen. This is a form of freedom to express personal identity and autonomy never before seen. However, the dark side of the digital revolution is also becoming gradually clear. Our personal data has become a new type of property, collected, analyzed, and exploited by technology corporations, seriously threatening personal privacy. Algorithms govern the information we consume, creating filter bubbles that threaten to limit diversity of thought. Freedom of speech is sometimes abused to spread fake news and hate. Governments and corporations have the ability to surveil citizens, tracking every online behavior in sophisticated ways, raising big questions about the boundaries between national security, commercial interests, and individual freedoms, especially digital privacy. In the complex and ever-changing context of the modern world, individual freedom is not simply freedom from state or society as in traditional definitions. It has evolved into a deeper, more multifaceted value, including the right to self-determination over one's life, the right to choose one's personal and career path, the right to be protected from invasion of privacy both in real life and online, and the right to live true to one's unique nature without judgment or discrimination. It is the freedom to build one's personal identity, the freedom to pursue one's passions and interests, the freedom to shape one's personal future through education, work, and relationships. It is not just the right to do what one wants, but also the right to make meaningful choices, to have the access to the necessary resources and support to realize those choices. This is a multidimensional value, both deeply personal and requiring respect and protection from the community, legal institutions, and the adjustment of public policies. Personal freedom is no longer a privilege or an abstract theory, but an essential foundation for the comprehensive development of each person and a civilized, progressive society. Personal freedom has had a long and tumultuous journey, from an alien concept to a core value, constantly reshaped by the progress of society and technology. But is this the end of the journey? While we are enjoying unprecedented forms of freedom, another revolution is quietly taking place, the technological revolution, which promises to upgrade humans themselves. So, as technology begins to deeply integrate into our bodies and minds, will personal freedom be transformed, expanded, or challenged once again? Don't miss the next video to find out. Humans begin to upgrade themselves with technology.